So we're going to take a look at the first chapter, which is actually dealing with why are we even in here? What do we need payroll records for? What do we need personal records for? And most importantly from this chapter, in my opinion, is what pieces of legislation and what authoritative bodies are predetermining or mandating how we process payroll and how we hold on to records and what do we do with them. Once I get your I-9 and your W-4, what's my requirements? What do I do with them now? So we're going to identify, number one, identify different laws that we use. We're going to actually look at record keeping. And then in number three, we're going to tie in how the payroll department interacts with human resources. And that's a really critical linkage. We're going to look at the different kinds of information shown on required forms. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at the documents that we use to record payroll, which is the payroll register and an employee's earnings records. And those are behind the scenes digitally. They're just fields now that we fill in, but you need to know what data is being compiled and what we use it for. So the payroll profession has become quite enhanced as far as from a career standpoint, from a monetary standpoint, because of the complexity of payroll law. And also because if you don't know what you're doing and you're not making deposits on time or doing the reports correctly, there's quite significant penalties that go with that. So an employer is really counting on his or her payroll professional to get the job done professionally and accurately. So with that, you can see that we're seeing a huge rise in the compensation for payroll managers. Of course, these aren't Montana numbers, but these are averages across the country. You've got opportunities to have a professional membership in the APA, and they also have a code of ethics that directs the profession in things like obviously confidentiality, accuracy. You hold generally all of the wage and hourly compensation data for a whole firm, so there's a lot of ethical permutations that go with that. So there's a lot of laws that affect payroll, and I just want to point out that I'm going to call them by their acronyms. So I'll always put up the full name of a law, and then I'll give you the acronym. And in the business world or in the payroll world, we don't say Fair Labor Standards Act. We say according to FLSA. So you need to start kind of learning the acronyms because that's how I'll talk. We'll have a quiz in a couple weeks. It'll ask you to kind of regurgitate all these acronyms just it's the language of payroll. So the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in the 30s. So gosh, 80 years old now. It was part of the New Deal, or a precursor to the New Deal. Anybody remember or know from their history books what the New Deal was? Who was president? Yeah, FDR. And the New Deal was, it's touted as the most significant, socially significant piece of legislation in the 20th century, and so far Obamacare in the 21st century. In other words, crafting and shifting social policy through tax and payroll tax law. Okay? But the Fair Labor Standards Act dealt with, these are just giving the overview, sorry. Okay, so let's just go through this kind of laundry list and then I'll dig into them. So the second one is the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. That was also passed as part of the New Deal. And this is where Social Security and Medicare come from. I'll be talking a lot more about that. FICA, Federal Insurance Contribution Act, established Social Security and Medicare. We also have a number of income tax withholding laws, both at the federal, the state, and sometimes at the local levels. On December 13th, the largest piece of tax legislation in 40 years passed, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA. And most of us, our heads still spinning. I have a tax practice and I've had clients calling me up left and right, and how's this going to impact me? And I'm like, I don't know. I got to go to a webinar. It's 1,900 pages. I do not have my head wrapped around it yet. So, I know the broad brushstrokes of it, but so it's important as payroll professionals. You also have to have a grasp on what tax law is, right? And how does it impact your employees and the owners and the shareholders and the folks that you process compensation checks for. We have a state income tax in Montana. We don't, well, I take that back. We do have a local tax here, but it's not an income tax. It's a bed and breakfast tax, so to speak. Then you've also got to comply with unemployment tax acts. We have unemployment tax acts at both the federal and the state level. So there's plenty to know about administering and complying with them. FUTA is the Federal Unemployment Tax Act, and SUTA is the State Unemployment Tax Act. So there's some more acronyms. Oops. We also have quite a fair amount of fair employment laws, non-discriminatory laws, civil rights laws, Americans with Disability Act, AMA, FLMA, lots of laws that cover your relationship with your employees and what the courts have held to be fair employment practices in this country. And that's all part of complying and linking the payroll department with the human resource department. Some states, for example, Montana, has got a minimum wage law that is more aggressive than federal minimum wage. So you've got to comply with the state minimum wage laws. So you have to be conversant with what your state employment laws are in addition to federal laws, because you're required to comply with whichever one is most arduous or gives the highest compensation to the employee. And this, with the new administration, look for changes to many payroll and labor laws that may not be reflected within these slides. We haven't, these slides were written last, well, right after the new administration came in. There has not been, I mean, the tax law cuts are huge and significant, but there has not been as many changes in actual labor laws as were originally anticipated. So I don't have a ton of update on that. Okay, FLSA. FLSA was passed in 1938, again, as part of the New Deal. For the first time, it established a minimum wage in this country. And as you can imagine, prior to minimum wage, companies could pay whatever they could get people to work for, and oftentimes that wasn't even close to a living wage. There's also the advent of child labor laws. Prior to the FLSA, you could employ children. There was no legal statutes that prohibited employing children. It's the first time that we saw equal pay for equal work provisions. And 80 years later exactly, women have just cracked the 80% mark. We make about 80% of men in this country. So for years and years and years, it was in the low to mid 70s. It's creeping upwards. I think it's 81% now that women on average make 81% of a man's compensation in the United States. So we still have a long ways to go. This law applies to, I'm on the fourth bullet now, companies that are involved in interstate commerce, or they produce something that can be used in interstate commerce. And interstate commerce refers to anything that crosses state lines. So if I am a cattle rancher and I package my beef and it goes over state lines, I'm involved in interstate commerce. I have to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act. If I'm DeLine Box and I make boxes and I only sell them to my local meat producers, but then they put their meat in it and my boxes go across state lines, I'm engaged in interstate commerce. I've got to comply with the FLSA. One of the other things the FLSA does is requires that stringent payroll records be maintained, and that's super important because if you've got some sort of a potential suit or claim or grievance against your employer, and they're like, oh, sorry, I didn't maintain the records, I didn't archive last year. How can you have any sort of, resolution to your wage claim? So this was pretty profound in that it requires that employers maintain and archive employment records for up to 7 years. So your claims can go back and it can be adjudicated with some, database. So FICA, you're going to be hearing a whole lot about FICA. Again, Federal Insurance Contribution Act. It's comprised of two pieces, OASDI and HI. And most of us are not familiar with these terms. We're familiar with what the lexicon is around them, which is OASDI is Social Security and HI is Medicare. But the real names for them, old age, survivors, and disability insurance. So Social Security is not just payments to retired folks. It's also payments to survivors. So if you've had a parent or you're a dependent of somebody and that person you're a dependent of passes and you're still a minor, you're a survivor under Social Security law and you have a right to a portion of that person's benefits if you were their dependent. And then also long-term disability comes from our OASDI system or our Social Security system. So if you're permanently disabled and it's been judged that you have long-term disability, you will get part of your payments depending upon what the situation was from Social Security, from OASDI, part of your compensation. So it's a trust fund. That means that it's actuarially determined. That's kind of a hard word to say. When something is actuarially determined, it's an analysis, a statistical analysis of risk and who's paying into the pool and what's the risk of people needing to pull out of the pool. And I'm sure you've heard lots of scuttlebutt about how Social Security is, quote unquote, going broke. And basically the reason is because actuarially we have not changed the rate that we pay, the actual percentage that we pay into Social Security for 30-some years. And when Social Security was first founded, there was, I think, like 5 workers for every 1 retired person. And now there's less than 1 working person for every 1 retired person because the baby boomers are retiring, right? The triangle's upside down, the number of workers supporting, right? So you can see the conundrum. When there's only X amount of workers and you're committed to not changing the rate, and there's more people taking benefits, it really doesn't take an actuary to see what's going to happen, right? So what's interesting about this is it's the name of a law, but it's also the name of the tax. So you'll see on your paycheck, FICA withholding. Or it might be broken down into OASDI withholding and HI withholding, or they might call it Social Security and Medicare. That's the thing that's a little bit, confusing, is that it can be referred to a lot of things on your paycheck. But the long and the short of it, the interesting thing about this is it's required that you pay into it, and it's also required that your employer matches it. And it's the only tax that looks like that. So both you and your employer pay into it. So whatever the rate is, it's double. So you pay in 6.2% of your check, of your gross, into OASDI, and 1.45 into Medicare. But those numbers are essentially doubled because there's an employer share as well.
And those numbers haven't changed in 30 years?
Mm-hmm. I'll show you what has changed. The cap has changed. actually went up a lot this year. So these are the percentages. We're going to go over this a ton of times, but you need to start kind of wrapping your head around it. So your question being, so the rates haven't gone up? No, but what goes up is the cap. In other words, how much, at what point of my salary do I stop paying in? So there's no cap on Medicare. If I'm the new president of the University of Montana, $305,000 salary. Okay? Well, which is evidently coming down. He was making, the last time that they pulled his numbers from General Electric, it was 8 figures. He was on a very aggressive stock option plan. So he's taken a huge hit to come here. There's no cap, so you pay it on whatever you make, right? But with Social Security, you stop paying it when you get to 127.2. This number goes up every year. So if you're making, pretty high dollar, it is going to impact you, right? Last year the number was like 118,000. So if I'm making 300 grand, I just have another 9,000 that I've got to pay 6.2% on. So the percentages don't change, the cap does. But as you can see, if you're somebody making your average wage in Missoula, raising the cap doesn't do anything down what you pay in, does it? It's only if you're high income. Okay, we're going to talk a bunch more about this. Income tax withholding. Again, so the book you've got is actually out of date. Because all the rates that are in here and all the tables are done. They're as of December 16th. So this book is written pre-December 16th, when we had 6 tax rates. Okay. And I'm embarrassed that I can't do this without looking, but we've now got 7 tax rates, and the highest one falls somewhere in here, and it starts at 10, and the gradation is, there's lots of little increments, like it's 10, 12, 15, 22, 24. There's a lot of smaller gradations. So all of our withholding tables are changing. All of your, if you work a set amount of hours a week at a set wage, your paychecks are going to start changing in February. I mean, I can tell you if it's going to go up or down. It depends upon where you fall. So federal income tax is levied on the earnings of employees. It's based on your gross wages. There's a lot of things you don't pay federal income tax on, like any amount you put into your 401k, right? Any amount you put into a flex plan, any amount that you put into paying health insurance premiums pre-tax, or that you're putting into your health savings account. So there's a lot of things that you don't have to pay federal income tax on. And you, as payroll processors or business managers, that's an area that can get pretty gritty pretty quick. But you've got to make sure you're doing it correctly. Otherwise, at the end of the year, your employees are going to be, holy crap. I owe in a bunch of money, or I'm getting a really giant refund. Why would that make somebody unhappy?
Because it's interest-free money that you won't government.
Yeah, I mean, I want that $200 a month in my pocket to decide what I'm going to do with it. I don't want the government to be keeping it. So, I mean, it's never as hard to tell a client, like, you're getting a giant refund as much as you owe a chunk of money. But it's not a good thing either. The goal is to be pretty close to even.
What about like IRAs?
IRAs are also tax-free.
Up to a point.
Mm-hmm. Up to a point.
So there's like contribution limits, and then.
But there's limits based on how much money you make, and then there's limits. So if you're pretty high income, you lose the ability to put in your maximum amount into an IRA. And then there's also annual amounts. This year, and again, I mean, I'll just be honest, I don't know what's in the whole 1,900 pages. Before I left for Nicaragua, you could put in $5,500 a year if you were under 50 years old, and up to $6,500 a year if you were older than 50. But I'm sure those numbers have changed. Or maybe not. Stay tuned. Unemployment Tax Acts. FUTA and SUTA. Federal unemployment is an employer-only tax. You don't pay it. Your employer pays it. It's 0.6% of the first $7,000 you pay everybody. So if you all work for me and I pay each of you $50,000 a year, I only pay FUTA up to the first $7,000. That's the cap for FUTA. But it's an employer-only tax, so y'all don't need to worry about it as employees. FUTA is, however, not where your benefits come from. FUTA is simply an administrative tax that basically pays the feds to make sure, it pays the feds who oversee the states to make sure the states are complying with statutory requirements. The state act, the SUTA, the Montana SUTA Act, is where you go as an employee to claim your benefits, if you have some, or if you've been laid off and you want to claim benefits. It's where the employer pays actuarially determined SUTA rates to, and those can be high. And those can be 4, 5, 6%. The cap this year for Montana is $31,000. So if I'm an employer, I'm going to pay SUTA on each of you up to $31,000 of wages. And then I'm done. I mean, that could be a big tax. In some states, employees also pay a little bit towards SUTA. So you as an employee would also have to pay into it a little bit, but that doesn't exist in Montana. But like, I think on the one that we do for GlobeRate, that manual one that we do at the end of the continuing payroll problem, that in that scenario, the employees pay in a little bit too, but it's a small percentage.
What's the percentage of SUTA?
It can range anywhere from like 1 to 6.5%.
Okay.
And we'll take a look at that some tax tables that I want you to start kind of memorizing. We'll take a look at those on Thursday. Fair Employment Laws. Civil Rights Act, 1964. Prohibits discrimination in hiring, firing, compensating, promoting, based on these 5 facets: color, race, national origin, religion, or gender. There's been a lot of addendums since, because, for example, this didn't include anything about gender preference. This didn't include anything about age. This didn't include anything about disabilities. So there's been a lot of add-ons, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is kind of the granddaddy of fair employment laws. And it's what those of us who may be activists around this kind of thing would look to as a guidance or boilerplate and how to craft legislation to protect other classes of people. So the Civil Rights Act of 1991 was a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it actually can adjudicate punitive damages if you discriminate voluntarily or willfully. So hard to prove that I'm just clueless and didn't mean to discriminate, and I wantonly and purposefully discriminated against a protected class. But if you can prove that, I can actually sue you for not only compensatory damages, in other words, compensation for lost wages, but punitive. In other words, I'm going to punish you, I'm going to hurt you for doing that financially. That's what a punitive damage is. And we've seen this law, we've seen this statute utilized for this purpose. ADEA was a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act 3 years later. Who signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964? Who envisioned the Civil Rights Act? Who fought for it and then died? Kennedy. So who signed it? Johnson. Johnson actually signed it, but it was Kennedy's baby. Johnson's still in the presidency in 67. I think he declined to run in, what, 68? Gave us a whole new era. Our friend Nixon. So ADA basically just put age as one of the protected classes. It was like an addendum to the Civil Rights Act. And it was protection for people over 40 years old. There's exclusions to it or exceptions to it if you are in an industry like the airline industry. Right? You have 80-year-old pilots. Could, but I mean, so there's industries, certain industries, usually around safety and transportation and things like that, where you can dictate age for protection or security reasons. And then I think another exception is that the person is in a really pivotal executive management role that can determine the fate of a company. There's some exception around that. And then, of course, back to the employer's got to keep really good records. ADA. ADA was another add-on. This was 1994, I believe. Let's see, when did Clinton come in? 92. Yeah, this was one of Clinton's first big pushes, ADA. And it prevents an employer, and you'll see when you see these funny things written into law, like with 15 or more employees, that's the result of negotiations on the House, right? I'm sorry, on the floor. So it prevents employers with 15 or more employees from discriminating against a qualified person based on his or her disability. So it doesn't apply to anybody that might have a disability. It applies to somebody that comes seeking a job or a promotion or a compensation adjustment in my organization, and they're qualified for whatever it is that they're seeking. If I discriminate, if you can prove that I discriminated against them based upon their disability, you violated the ADA. Now, and we'll come back to this in a second. Let me give you the second premise of ADA, which is equally, if not more important, which says that employers must provide reasonable accommodation to people with disabilities to enter and flourish in their workplace. So what does that mean to you? You have to make your buildings wheelchair accessible. You need to make your restrooms wheelchair accessible. You need to make your meeting rooms wheelchair accessible. Okay?
So that one is what probably much more specific people that went to the House.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the result of negotiations. I mean, I think negotiations are a really important part of our legislative process, but what sometimes evolves from that is it accommodates very specific groups that have really specific needs, or it can be, on the other end, really vague and unapplicable. This has been really, the ADA has been tied up in court for 30 years. So, reasonable accommodation. If I lost my eyesight, that's about the only thing that I can think of that I could lose immediately that would really impair my ability to do my job. Would it be then beholden upon the University of Montana to accommodate me? I've been here for 26 years, I've got good evaluations, I run a successful program, or would you consider that reasonable accommodation? I mean, they'd have to probably hire some sort of a coach and somebody that could, yeah. Is that reasonable?
No.
Okay. Is it reasonable if I worked for 6 months? Is it reasonable if I'm applying for a job? So you say, but I say different. She says different again. One more time.
What shouldn't it be for somebody that's applying for a job?
That's what I'm saying. How do you determine
That's
what's
not
reasonable?
That's to say that person can do a good job anywhere,
So that's the point. And then you have to take it also from, like, this was a real life experience that happened to me when I was controller of a biological pharmaceutical company back in Colorado, is we had, this was pre-ADA, so 91, 90, 91, somewhere in there. And we had a wet lab. We did original research on biologicals. And we had a microbiologist opening. And a gal came and applied to us in a wheelchair. And our workstations we're all at whatever that is, 42 inches, I think. So she would have required a ramp to get to the different workstations. And it was a big lab. So, but you couldn't just build the workstation because then everybody else would be up too high. So it had to be some sort of a mobile, movable workstation. Well, then you got into all sorts of OSHA violations, right? Safety violations and health violations because you've got these, ramps and where are you going to store them and who's going to move them. And so, I mean, it becomes very complicated very quickly. We were also a really small company, 20 people. And it was going to be, a $50,000 fix. So these are the issues, she should have had it right. She was the most qualified microbiologist that applied to us. But for a small lab, the barriers for us were really great. So what is reasonable accommodation? That's the whole point. So ADA has been, what is the movie that I just saw? I have to look this up and tell you. It was a phenomenal movie if you're into just how movements and political unrest craft new eras of rights. The watching the live clips of the disabled movement is some of the most gut-wrenching things you've ever seen because people are out of their wheelchairs and it's really tough to watch. But this was the outcome. It's not a perfect law, but it has really shifted access. When I was in college and grad school even, there were buildings on campus that folks in wheelchairs just couldn't get into. Or they could get into it and there wasn't an elevator. So things have really, really changed. Okay, one more and then we'll call it a day. Oh, this is a long one. Federal Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. This was also one of Bill Clinton's keystone pieces of legislation, and most people know it by the layman's terms of welfare reform. Super complex, super wide-ranging piece of legislation. I think people forget when they look at history, this was a Democratic president with a majority in the Democrats in the Senate that passed sweeping welfare reform, really ratcheted back and inhibited what a lot of people referred to as the growing welfare state in America. How it pertains to payroll is very specific in that one of the things that the law did was to look into key drivers of poverty in America, why people were on lifetime welfare rolls, so to speak. And nothing profound here, but one of the key takeaways is single parent families have much higher propensity to be have lifetime need for welfare. And on top of that, many single parent families, the absent parent wasn't paying his or her child support or adequate child support. And back then, pre-96, all you had to do was move over state lines to get out from underneath it. There was no cross-check, right? So if I didn't want to pay child support to my ex-husband and my kids, I just moved to Idaho, okay? Easy peasy. Now, since 96, and how this law affects payroll, we have the system called new hire reporting forms, where as an employer, within 30 days, you've got to either fill out a form or shoot a copy of the employee's W-4 and send it to Helena. And then there's a whole division in Helena that inputs the data, and that's all mined and coalesced in Washington, D.C. at the Office of Child Support Enforcement. So if I move to Vermont or Texas or wherever to get out from underpaying child support, my paycheck's going to get cross-checked against my spouse who's claiming on me, and my paycheck's going to get garnished, and it's going to make its way back to Montana.
So, but that's only if they can find you, right?
That's if you go to work somewhere and you fill out a W-4.
But you're legitimate.
Yeah, if you go underground, it's a lost cause. There's no way to track it.
Right. Because my daughter's father's in California, and I don't know his worker, I don't know his social, I don't know anything, so I can't get.
But in California, if he's working above the table, in other words, for an employer where he had to fill out a W-4, and he gets a paycheck with taxes taken came out of them and everything, they have to do a new hire reporting form.
But then how would I say, me living in Montana, how do I say,
I would
this
call,
guy with the first name and last name, that's pretty much all the information I have.
I would call the franchise tax board.
Would get a hold of.
I would call the franchise tax board in Sacramento. That's the name of their Department of Revenue, the FTE.
I feel like there's no way for me to find him.
Have you filed, through the state of Montana, you haven't filed with them?
For years. Because California and Montana, they're separate states, they go.
But it's all coalesced at the Office of Child Support Enforcement in DC, the OCSE. I would either look at the OCSE, the Office of Child Support Enforcement, or look at the Franchise Tax Board website and see if there's any. I'm assuming if you're working with somebody in the know in Montana that they have already pursued those
Because
avenues,
they have.
which would lead me to believe that he's not working with you.
Right. I'm not fair enough.
Yeah, and that's the thing, that's what, happens to a lot of people. The other thing that happens, that you see happening, is if say your spouse does, move to LA and starts working and he fills out a W-4 and he gets his first paycheck and it's down $500 because it's been garnished, then they're just gone anyways. They just go underground anyways because, yeah. So, but with that said, the stats on the number of dollars that have been transferred from absent parents to single parents is phenomenal. It's been a really, really, really successful program on the whole. Not successful if you're the one person sitting there going, yeah, it's successful
And
for
you
you.
also think about that person too, like, that absent parent might not actually be absent at all, and yet they're all going to be being garnished, and the mom getting all this money, basically, because she has.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, I don't hear a lot of those stories. Those are not the stories I hear. I mean, not saying that doesn't
I always
exist.
feel bad for, like, the dads that are there, and they're seeing all this money, the mom.
Absent parent not necessarily meaning absent out of their lives, just meaning absent out of the household, but still having some financial liability for providing shelter, food, and health care and recreation to their kids. I don't necessarily mean
No, I know, but that's what I'm saying too, is that they could just be living next door, and they're still being, they're almost 35 paycheck too.
Yeah, again, I mean, I'm not, I don't hear that many of those stories, but not to say that they're
No, I just meant because you just said that sometimes they could get $500, taking
Oh.
someone left with $100 off of your paycheck.
not. Well, okay, the example I was giving there's percentage constraints on how much of your disposable income can be garnished.
Oh, okay, so you can't.
Yeah, so when I was saying 500, I was thinking about somebody making a couple grand.
Okay.
Yeah, there's percentage limitations, and I think that varies state by state. It can be high. In Montana, it's up to 60%. So I don't know about most of you, but if I lost 60% of my paycheck, I'd be not in such great shape. So the numbers are high, but also a lot of those numbers too are for catch-up provisions too. You got to get caught up with your child support, and then it gets to be something more manageable. Okay, so I think that's all I've got to say for today. So you should read chapter 1. You should get signed up on the CLGL, and you should do the homework, please, for Thursday. Thank you. Have a great week.
You too.